Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for your rich presentation, your really thoughtful observations, and congratulations to you and your team for your work on the research and digitization of the archives of independent art spaces in Taiwan. This session, as the title suggests, Independence as an Institutional Interstice, situates the alternative or independent art spaces not necessarily or not solely as a binary opposition to the institution, but rather through its interstitial condition, that in-between space that Gritya spoke about so beautifully yesterday in her keynote address. To think of the independent art space as an interstice allows us to see the many negotiations, dialogues, and alliances that are constitutive of these spaces. These spaces also test and open up possibilities for what creative practice can look like. They produce new imaginaries for thinking about the figure of the artist and their role, one that is quite different from what gets discursively produced either in art schools or through collecting institutions. To paraphrase what our dear friends Rux Media Collective have said earlier, artists don't just produce art, they produce arenas. And I think this is true for many occasions, but most especially for the context of this symposium. And finally, these spaces produce forms of gathering, not just as spaces where people convene, which of course they do, but they enable us to think of gatherings and conversations as themselves modes of practice. We will explore these and several other facets of independent art spaces in our two presentations in this session. Our first speaker, Liu Pei, will provide context for how alternative art spaces in Taiwan emerged in the late 1980s following the end of martial law, running through various definitions and models for what alternative has meant, and how within these spaces, artists, as she says, practiced democracy, which is a really fascinating proposition. Our second speaker, Vidya Shivadas, will lay out the art institutional context in India, and from within this, she speaks about how recent initiatives in India, such as the Foundation for Indian Contemporary Art, FICA, serve as catalysts for empowering emergent artistic practices, making a case against seeing these spaces as isolated, and thinking instead through frameworks such as of translation. I will now introduce our first speaker. Liu Pei received her PhD in Humanities and Cultural Studies from the University of London. She is Director and Associate Professor of the MA program in Critical and Curatorial Studies of Contemporary Art at the National Taipei University of Education. Her research interests encompass contemporary curatorial studies, examining the mechanisms of art museums and biennials, as well as deliberating art practices beyond existing cognitive frameworks. Liu's writings are published in domestic and international conferences, academic journals, and books. Her essays are featured in Art and the City, Worlding the Discussion Through a Critical Art Space, and the Rutledge Companion to Art in the Public Realm, among others. Her books include Contemporary Art Curating in Taiwan, 1992 to 2012, and Art Movement as a Public Platform, a study of contemporary art and social movements. Please give a round of applause for our first speaker, Liu Pei.
各位早上好，非常感谢刚刚Nicole帮我们补充了很多的这个台湾独立艺术空间的各种的资料。那我在准备的时候其实也有担心这部分，我想这个补充可以让后面的讲者可能可以更专注在他们的讲题之上。那我想我今天是想要谈的是90年代初期台湾独立艺术空间作为观察对象，那主要还是以一通跟2号公寓，那主要在谈的是这些艺术家为主体，确保独立性、自主性的这种群聚空间，在台湾的解严之后的艺术生态中扮演这些关键性的角色。那 这个部分可能有一些初步的一些研究了，但是大部分的研究它还是聚焦在艺术形式的前卫性跟实验性上面。当时的整体社会氛围可能还是作为一个背景作为交代。但是这一次我的报告想要将目光聚焦于时代氛围，试图把这种80年代末90年代初出现的独立艺术空间放回到当时的社会、政治、经济、文化环境脉络之中，视之为一场艺术运动。第一个部分，我想谈一下替代空间这个词在台湾的出现、沿用跟影响。那大概会包含这几个部分，包括了空间让这个替代成为一种可能性，以及2000年之后更多的这个所谓的替代变成了某一种生存的机制。那以及空间意涵在里面可能有的这个不同的面向。1991年底，《艺术家》杂志第199期刊出了一篇与中青辈艺术家对谈系列7，从当代艺术替代空间展望台湾现代艺术的发展。那这个是当年10月26号的座谈会记录，邀请了2号公寓、一通公园以及非常短命年轻的一个团队一个空间叫 No.1， 他们的成员参与讨论。那座谈会的第一集就是何谓替代空间？为什么会有替代空间的出现？替代空间是在何种理念下集结成型？如何生存？它对台湾现代艺术的发展有何正面的意义？召集人黄丽娟从 Alternative Space 这个出现于欧美的空间形态来谈。那在这个切入点就可以看到，所谓的 Alternative Space 作为台湾这些空间的某种学习模式，以及用来预测未来可能面临的各种问题。像是连德腾说到的，替代空间就是艺术家系统，就是在美术馆、画廊、艺术家工作室之外的各种展示的空间。那它分为2种，一种是以会员制共同维持，有点像是艺术系统的先修班。那另外一种是属于前卫的，完全排斥既定的艺术系统。那不管是第一种或第二种空间，他们的发展都会有问题，因为替代空间虽然是为艺术家铺路，艺术家还是会面临到被体制收编的问题。那这个在国外它非常明显，所以这个问题其实在1991年就已经提出来了。那同时从这个标题你也可以看到，它透露了一个关键的讯息，就是它把替代空间跟当代艺术连结在一起，然后用来对应当时既有的现代艺术，也就是美术馆的机制。认为替代空间是在既有系统之外某一种新的或是更当代的可能性。那座谈会的发言，这3个空间的代表各自叙述，然后可以看到这个替代空间在台湾这个初期的一些特征。第一个是私空间的开放与延伸，所以像是2号公寓是萧台新的自家的住宅，2号公寓是刘庆堂的工作室 ，No.1 是艺术家肥启瑜的工作室。那像是讲这个一东公园，就说这本来就是一个客厅的延伸，或是当初取名为公园，就是觉得会很舒适，然后自由很重要。那第二个是它其实是一个友谊群聚的自由空间，聚集一群朋友在一起，创作任何形式的作品都可以。那更重要的是艺术家跟艺术家之间的关系。然后另外一位发言者谈到，替代空间有一个很大的作用是唤醒了艺术家的自觉。那它也是另外一个机制。像是川普在谈一通公园，就说 替代空间是美术馆跟画廊之外扮演的另一个角色，另一个空间。然后很多人谈到的是非商业的立足点，或是像是Number One 的这个负责人谈到的是20几岁的创作者更不容易找到展览空间，所以他要提供一个这空间给更年轻的艺术家。2号公寓的成员连德成在1993年发表了替代空间替代什么，一样是透过这3个空间来做一个归纳整理。那在这里面，连德成指出了，虽然台湾的替代空间是非营利性的，但是艺术家偶尔还是可以做些小买卖，并不是严厉的反商系统。然后替代空间在台湾主要是空间的问题，而不是替代的问题。也就是说，在西方的替代空间的前卫性、反体制的精神，在我们的替代空间中是很难看到的。第3个是台湾的替代空间多为提供一个中性空间，而不是另一个空间，因此比较强调在艺术形式上的实验。那连德成的这篇文章基本上就是去对比 Alternative Space 在欧美的系统，以及90年代初这3个空间所展现出来的差异性。他在1994年的时候的另外一篇文章《一个替代空间之死》，也把前面这3点也纳入了。那同时也提出了，在台湾替代空间是一种艺术机制，作为美术馆与画廊的再现。那他更准确的用望梅止渴、画饼充饥来比喻这个暂时的替代性。认为说这个替代空间其实是会从边缘支流向中心主流汇集。那这个也是刚刚你会有提到的，到最后可能会吸纳进机制或是主流。那第2个是东西方文化的奴化过程具体的现场，所以有点像是这个西方的文化在台湾落地的时候，互相冲击的一个地点。那第3个是不仅是艺术家的空间，也是人的空间。那在这边他提到的是，之前的机制是画会，那画会是一群艺术家的集合，但是画会可能在80年代末90年代已经渐渐的凋零，他用的字叫凋零。画会强调的这种是一种交集，是希望大家的相似性结合在一起的。但是替代空间，它是各路英雄好汉，希望不求同，而是希望去彰显那个差异性。那替代空间是人的空间，而在这个空间里面是去彰显大家的差异，而不是相似。从90年代初的这3篇文章，其实就可以勾勒出了替代空间在台湾的样貌、特质与困境。在30年后，我在2011年担任一个这本书的主编，岛空间亚洲后替代空间，是这本书收录了21个亚洲艺术家经营空间的实录。那30年后再提这个议题，一样还是用替代空间这个词。那这个计划的发起人姚瑞忠，用了后替代空间这个词，叫 post alternative space， 用来对照所谓的替代空间。那在这里面，他就指出了90年代替代空间，基本上它的这个自觉性高、性格强烈、社会参与度高，但是因为这个争议性比较大，可以一方面吸引这个大众的这个参与，但是他还是在坚持所谓的艺术有限的独立性跟纯粹性，然后不要过度的受到政治跟商业市场的左右。但2000年之后，刚刚你会有提到这个部分，各种的政府补助，当然也包括了经济的这个改变，所以替代空间为了要这个生存，所以不排斥向政府部门申请艺文补助，然后主动的去跟企业界募款，或跟用公司名义去进行各种活动。 那在这边就是用一个后替代空间作为了一个这个词汇。那姚一中他的这个观察，基本上是着眼于如何生存、如何继续。然后在这本书的后续，又过了10几年，我们也看到很多空间其实也是结束了营业了。但是这样的角度可能会限制我们观看这些有群具有创造空间的可能性，可能无法反映当时的政治、经济、社会激烈转向的时代氛围。所以在编辑这本书的时候，其实我倾向于用艺术家空间 （artist run space） 来替代所谓的 alternative space， 把它当成是一个友谊作为基础的共识空间，是一场朋友的朋友的朋友的聚会，艺术家的聚会所，透过独立制作的方法来制造各式各样的活动行动。那刚刚提到的杨家璇在2012年，也就是差不多的时间，出版了另外一本是专门是台南的艺文空间的回访。那他指出了，其实是带出了台南的这个替代空间发展模式是完全跟台北的这个想象也不太一样，而是用附带的餐饮或书店的复合模式，或是像是艺术家共同集资的合作画廊。那这个已经完全不是说非盈利了，而是希望透过盈利的方式去资助这些艺术家的创作环境。所以新生代艺术环境或是编曲文化，就是这样的案例。那台南还有另外一个特色是，这些艺术空间其实长期以来都有非常强烈的互相帮忙、互相协力、互相扶持的状态，直到今天。所以这样子的一个状态，可以用关系空间来更明确的去描述这样子的一个友谊性的基础的空间实践。那这一次亚洲文献库的这个3年期的台湾独立艺术空间档案计划，以独立艺术空间这3个字，也突破了替代空间的这个词汇，那打开了想象，也打破了这个认识上的这个限制。那从这些档案里面，我就更仔细的看了2号公寓我之前不太熟悉的这个资料。那我会发现说，其实如果把这些不同的空间放下来，回应到80年代末90年代初的时代，其实是一个非常好的作为一个时代的记录。尤其是1987年几年的当年，那个艺评陈传兴写下了当时他对于台湾艺评的艺坛的看法。他是说，跟政治社会的剧烈变动比较起来，在1987年这一年，艺坛的创作是极端的保守跟萎缩，所以完全是一个相对照的。那我觉得他的这个形容非常的有意思，他的意思是有点像是在远方的地方有闪电跟雷声，然后这些雷声跟闪电吸引了这些人，但是大家却也很害怕，不小心被雷给击中了，所以大家其实是有一种几乎是本能式的失去常态的狂奔，而这种狂奔其实是要寻求掩蔽，所以反而就是有点像是先暂停一下看一看，先观望一下。但是在解严1-2年之后，其实艺术家对于社会政治的不满以及批判声音开始完全不断的向外爆发，那艺术家的态度也从观望到主动积极的参与，尤其是小剧场部分，更是直接的参与社会运动，例如1988年反核的行动剧《驱除岛屿的恶灵》，以及1989年520艺术实践联展，都是用文化抗争去直接去回应当时发生的社会运动。那1988年成立的一通公园，基本上它的这个应对整体的社会状态有点像是一种冷处理。在1994年，王文浩在谈说从88年到90年代的这个一通，他说对照当时的社会，一通确实是一个有趣的存在。那对于这些社会的乱象，一通始终是冷眼旁观。那如果要说一通在这段伟大的时代缺席，可是我宁可相信 我们做出动作，这个动作就是不动作；我们做出反应，这个反应也就是不反应。所以一通是透过保持清醒和自主性来确保这个他们所创造的这个艺术的空间。那在1990年代短暂出现的这个团体台湾档案室，他们的成立宣言可以明确的看到艺术家在那个时代的一些思考。那这个台湾档案室其实也包括了2位，包括了2号公寓的连德成，然后马毅老师当时也是一通的成员。那他们有几个人一起组成了这个台湾档案室。那他们谈到的就是说，他们感觉到越来越多艺术工作者是在反映现实的思考、批判，然后也是尝试对于体制要反叛，要制造新的形式，但是他们都找不到场地，他们不会被画廊接受，也不会被美术馆接受。那他们觉得这些创作的时代精神会被掩盖，所以他们希望把有相同反省的艺术工作者结合起来，然后作为一个时代的记录。同样是2号公寓的成员，连德成，他的创作基本上就直接回应了社会现实，然后他也有一篇文章是艺术不是抗争的武器，然后去说明这个立场。因为时间的关系，我可能要更快一点。艺术空间作为民主练习，我把它当成是一场艺术运动。那我提到了几个不同的一个可能性去观看。第一个是显艺，就是这些艺术家其实是来自各地的英雄好汉，那他们都希望跳脱权威的体制，然后在这样的自由空间里面去展现自己的差异性。第二个是这个这些艺术家经营的空间其实具有某种的公共性，这个公共性可能从最原初的时代就已经出现了。例如谈到2号公寓是说没有老板，也不是个人，而是一个共同体。那他们通常是共同出资、共同决策、共同经营，然后这个也是用互助的方式。提供像一通公园，它可能是提供一个新的实验空间，可以让外部去自由的申请，可以确保边缘的新的或是弱的机会有发生的可能性。那另外一个部分，从那个空间的命名，其实就可以看到，像是公园，或是档案室，或是像新兵码头的码头。然后，或者是像是对于整体环境艺术的期待，例如新生态、新乐园、乐园。然后，当然在他们的这个营运里面，这个合作画廊的这个形态就很清楚。像是当年的这个报纸标题就会提到说，2号公寓不谈生意，然后说2号公寓是自力救济，说它是艺术家合资。它可以忠于自我，所以在这边都可以看到，这个合作经营是他们的这个特质。那高雄的阿普画廊，可能他们合作更为紧密。那6位成员不仅是经济的支柱，更是他们展览的严格的评审员。每一个展览必须要全数通过才能展出。所以这些公共精神其实具有扁平组织、直接民主、集体决策的这些做法。然后再来是具有平等精神、自由氛围的，还有开放态度。例如一通的吧台，就是让所有人可以互相的这个讨论，然后他们也开辟了实验空间，可以接受申请。那2号公寓的话，就是每档展览都有座谈会，让艺术家、作品、观众可以同时共存，面对面去沟通。2号公寓的这个艺训，然后还有1号公寓跟其他空间的合作。像开放这个场域给学生，或是开放场域给当时的反文化团体、噪音团体。那他们也是一场艺术的运动。 他们对于社会运动社会的敏锐观察，把社会议题带入展览，像是刚刚提到的台湾颂，包括了他的很多的这个文化批判的现象，或是他的这个2号公寓的最后一页名牌展，就是更是去谈那时候台湾的前烟角木的消费社会。那他们也推动了典范的转移，让艺术的这个实践从雕塑、绘画到装置行为、表演，然后也让这个从技术层面转向了观念、论述跟策划。那当然，他们也创造了另外一种体制，不同于画会、画廊、美术馆学院。那他同时也透过这个方法，把这些成员推入了一个主流的美术馆画廊系统。那他们也是引进了国际思潮，像一中公园的这个常常是国际策展人来拜访的第一站。那像2号公寓也有大量的女性艺术家，那这一些其实都是他们透过空间的营运，去推动了一场所谓的艺术运动。我会认为在这个90年代初，这些空间其实它扮演了一个所谓的民主练习的实践。在台湾解严之后扮演一个非常重要的角色。然后我也认为他们是在解严之后，这个众声喧哗的时代里面这一个发生之地。那艺术家用群聚的方式去演练民主，那把它视为是台湾民主化进程的一部分，是公民社会实践的路径之一。那在过了这段时间之后，90年代中期之后，其实文化治理越来越完备。那这样子的民主的进程又进到了另外一个新的阶段。那我的报告到这边，谢谢大家。
We'll now invite our second speaker. Vidya Shivadas is a curator based in New Delhi. She is the director of the Foundation for Indian Contemporary Art, a non-profit arts organization that works in the field of art education and aims to broaden the audience for contemporary Indian art, enhance opportunities for artists, and establish a continuous dialogue between the arts and the public through education and active participation in public arts projects. Vidya has curated a number of exhibitions at the Madeira Art Gallery since 2005, as well as guest-curated exhibitions at the Devi Art Foundation, the Kiran Nader Museum of Art, and the Edinburgh Art Festival. She was the visual arts curator for Serendipity Arts Festival in Goa in 2023. She has been visiting faculty at the School of Culture and Creative Expressions, Ambedkar University, Delhi since 2013. A warm welcome to Vidya. Hello. It's wonderful to be here with the organizers for bringing together this very important conference. It's wonderful to hear about this research project that the Shut-Up team has been doing around independent art spaces in Taiwan since the late 1980s. In India, the general discourse has been around a kind of underdeveloped institutional landscape that doesn't support and address the complexity and diversity of art production. But it's equally true that the archives of such efforts have been very scant and not necessarily produce the memories and robust afterlives of these initiatives. In 2023, the Sherdil Sundaram Arts Foundation took on the task of releasing a publication on the Kasoli Art Center and also an exhibition around it. And this was a project of summer workshops that Govind Sundar, the artist, ran at his home, his mother's home in Kasoli between 1976 and 91. And it was a very important space where artists, performers, scholars, and critical thinkers would come together, and there was a lot of exchange, interdisciplinary exchange, as well as collaborations, critical collaborations also, which went on to sort of incubate something like the Journal of Arts and Ideas later in the 90s. So this kind of, sort of work that SSAF has done in terms of putting out the publication and also building this exhibition that actually gives us an understanding about the relationship between the Punjab Museum, University Museum, and a space like the Solly Art Center, because the Punjab Museum is also funding them. So these kind of histories are sort of brought back into discussion. And I think this kind of initiative is only now taking off in India. Thanks very much to the Isharaka team in India, among other archiving initiatives. But there's a lot of ground to be covered. And the traces produced on institutional memory are very faint, as well as the imagination and how to document these. This lack is pronounced not only when it comes to artist-owned spaces and initiatives, but also histories of bigger institutions. So in the early years of independence, the overarching reach of the national institutions in building the art infrastructure for the nation is very much present. And you have institutions like the National Gallery of Modern Art and the Lalit Kala Academy were set up in the early 50s. And these institutions come up quite early, just 6 years after independence, anticipating other such initiatives in post-colonial nations by almost 3 decades. So this attempt at offering infrastructure and support for artists or producing a kind of canon and collection building, exhibition, audience involvement, and public engagement has been there, but it has also been quite checkered in terms of its reception. And I think, at that moment of independence, the whole assertion of self-assertion of the nation in the face of Cold War politics and non-alignment movement became quite critical. But they're always not able to kind of materialize the vision and activities of what art spaces should be doing and how they're sort of holding together the energy of art movements. By the 90s, we are also contending with the larger presence of the art market and the public-private and players kind of taking center stage within the art sector. And this is kind of following the move towards the liberalization of the Indian economy, which allows for private-public partnerships, for foreign investment, and reduction of the government control. And we see a spate of galleries opening up in the country. This report by KPMG and FICCI, which is a kind of industrial conglomeration, is also showing the kind of the substantial outlay of gallery infrastructure in India, especially the way that it grows by 2008, and how it's also playing quite a critical marketplace for the South Asian region. And we also realize that this entire infrastructure is also being built very highly concentratedly in Bombay and Delhi, so almost 65% of galleries in these two locations. There is also, in the 90s, you see a rise of the non-governmental activity in the various fields of development education, and this is starting from the post-emergency period of 1977, and there is foreign funding and involvement of the non-governmental sector working with governmental organizations to think around developmental activities. Its impact on the contemporary and modern art sector is quite small, even though there's more support for heritage, conservation, craft, and livelihood-related projects. So you see an institution like the India Foundation for the Arts, IFA, that comes into being in 1993 to really, it's able to sort of create a little bit of a space for innovative work happening in the field of arts and creating funding for that. But the galleries are definitely emerging as an eager set of players identifying the requirement of the field to build a robust market for modern and contemporary art, and the kind of infrastructure that they produce around this with art publications, with exhibition partnerships with national institutions. You have the auction houses that enter from the mid-90s, building a visible market and price benchmarks. The rest of it was and continues to be around the potential of growth in an art industry, which in the global share of the art industry stands at a very minuscule 0.5% in 2016. So yeah, India Fair is something that comes up in 2008 and builds another kind of visibility. What we're also seeing since 2010 is another kind of conversion taking place from private collections to public museums, from individual patrons to foundations, from galleries and small-scale exhibitions to large-scale biennales and festivals. The Devi Art Foundation, which came up in 2008, was an early initiative in this regard when Anupam and Lekha Poddar, their stellar collection, became kind of public and really provided a vision for curation of contemporary art in terms of the kind of artists that they were bringing together, which was not limited only to the Indian context, but also the way that they were installing exhibitions within their own home and in the corporate office. And this is a model that others like Piramal Museum or Art Foundation in Vadodara and Piramal Museum in Bombay, sort of emulate. The Kiran Nadar Museum is another one that comes up in 2010, again from Kiran Nadar's private collection and her desire to share this with the larger public. And the museum has really expanded at a breakneck speed to host very impressive retrospectives, collaborated with international museums, and also built a huge collection. And this is the model of the new museum that is coming up, which is a 1 million square feet site in Delhi, and it's designed by the Acharya Associates and is expected to open in 2027. And will be India's largest art and cultural center. The Serendipity Arts Foundation, which was started by the hero and the family, Sunil Munjal, has been hosting the Serendipity Arts Festival in Goa since 2015. And they're also looking for to have a cultural center running in New Delhi in the years to come. And of course, the most recent entrant has been the high-profile Nita Mukesh Ambani Cultural Center, which is the passion project of Nita Ambani, who's the founder and chairperson of the Reliance Foundation. And this center is all about providing world-class infrastructure for art exhibitions. So it's a 16,000 square feet museum in Bombay. The setting up of the corporate social responsibility in India with the enactment of the Companies Act of 2013 has also made it mandatory for companies to invest in CSR initiatives, and India was the first country to enact this as a legal requirement, and this has kind of also marked a shift in how businesses in India are approaching social responsibility. And as per the Economic Survey of 2023-24, CSR spending in India has increased by 53% from 2014 to 2022. An institution like the Museum of Art and Photography MAP in Bangalore, which came up in around 2020, is a good example of being built on such funding. So we're seeing this kind of shift in the field towards the non-profit sector, in a sense, because CSR is also guided by that. And also alongside the shrinking of foreign funding sources for non-governmental organizations in India, especially with the change in financial regulations in the past 5 years. There's been an amendment in the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act of 2020, the FCRA, which every NGO is required to have, and actually a revoking of many FCRA licenses in 2023, I think more than 50%. An institution like Coach, which was actually set up in the late 90s and really grew out of international support and network, both through their association with an organization like Triangle Arts Trust, which is dedicated to bringing artists together from different countries to explore ideas and practices, to the kind of funding they were able to raise from institutions like FIBOS, Prince Class Foundation, Ford Foundation. And, they have really sort of felt the impact, and Pooja Sood has been talking about this in various talks, about the need to now build domestic cultural philanthropy in the face of this kind of seismic shift. and of course, under her leadership, they have managed that very well. So what we're seeing is, a kind of shifting landscape and a particular kind of funding system that's coming into place. Also, the visibility and the impact-driven narrative of supporting arts in India, which are sort of materializing these initiatives. The tensions relating to the transition of private museums into public ones, of business into philanthropy with its thrust of motivated funding is also, of course, being debated. And the question remains how public these institutions are when it comes to audiences, to the artist community, to people who work there, when it comes to accountability, transparency, and autonomy. And perhaps it is a time for us to look back and think about these formations of public and private institutions within our context and what these categories stand now, where these categories stand now in our fast-changing context. Public today in India definitely speaks also of impoverishment of public universities in the Indian context, alongside the way that the state is forging a very directed relationship with art and culture, so quite different from these initial years where they were constantly criticized for a lack of brand and vision for modern and contemporary art. So this is definitely a moment to consider how we might function and negotiate with all these forces and visible contradictions. And the truth of the matter is also that the sector like art in the Indian context, amidst all the hyperbole of the economy that it's generating and can generate, is for the majority made up of people who function with very little or no financial resource and whose capacities to participate need to be strengthened and supported. And there is an urgency to this task also that one considers. And this is the kind of setting in which sort of, I'm going to think about the formation of FICA, the Foundation for Indian Contemporary Art, where I work, which was formed in 2007 and emerged as a hybrid situation where a non-profit arts organization was set up to support artists, educators, curators, researchers, and the art community at large through efforts in education, grant giving, and collaboration. Initially, we were supported by the Libera Art Gallery, a private gallery, financially, and also in the way that we used their infrastructure until 2014, after which they have been helping us with fundraising for our operational costs. And in terms of programs, of course, another very interesting phenomenon has been the formation of quite important artist organization, artist foundations like the Sheldon Fuller Art Foundation, which I mentioned, the Nalini Mukherjee Foundation, Ravi Agarwal just set up the Sharma Foundation, Shared Ecologies program. So all of these have also been, about a whole support structure that the senior artists are forming and giving back to the artist community. So in this kind of overlap between the support from a private gallery or from patrons, we've been able to sort of thinking about how we kind of can build another kind of organization structure that can support the artist community and build potentials in the field for learning and collective gathering. And these shifts and movements also need to be imagined and concretized in the way that we function. And one of the things that has guided us in this process is how to stay porous, how to stay small, and be open to artistic gestures and carry them forth. So this is one of our public art grants, and we had instituted this in 2008, and this is a project by Rani Barua, where she kind of used the raft and she was based in Assam, and the raft on Brahmaputra as a public space, and then for a year sort of activated this space with different kinds of programming. So one of the things that when we set up, we sort of kind of foregrounded the fact that we would like to be based in the reading room, and that was the space that we sort of conceptualized for ourselves. And this was a decision we made motivated by a decision to foreground reading and gathering, as it was a disavowal of getting saddled by a large building collection. And in 2000, and this space itself has been a very interesting fluid space for us, and we've been thinking with artists about what the space itself can be. So something like the Ambedkar Age Digital Book Mobile, this was a project that, this was again a public art project that we had given in 2019 to Smita Rajmani and Somnath Rajmani, and they built this portable trunk which carried material of anti-caste singers from Maharashtra, and they were focusing on a lot of smaller musicians who are not as well known in small cities and villages, and they created this kind of portable archive that could travel and open itself up, disperse in different like a pop-up exhibition, but also then become a site and activation for the concerts and conversations. And for us, this was a very interesting model for the reading room itself. In 2017, actually, there was a year when we didn't have a reading room, and we participated in an occupation of a soon-to-be-demolished house. This space was being used by Priyanka Chaudhary, an artist, and this was her studio. And here you see, actually, she built a pillar in the house where she put all her works into the pillar and sort of created a kind of architectural structure which could also be demolished with the house. And this whole experience of sort of sharing the precarity and the possibilities of the site that the artists were exploring was a very important transition for us. We experimented with artist Shanta Mandal to conceptualize a mobile library and then a whole range of talks, and even to think with works like Shaukat Taju's performance. This was a performance that he had done in the University Library at Srinagar Art College, and the entire library had actually been submerged in the 2014 flash floods in Srinagar and had to be burned down. So this was a performance he was doing before the actual burning happened. In another instance, and also just gatherings like this, which were very interesting and sort of created another way that people would come together. In another instance, we worked with artist Vasudha Tozur, who had to reimagine a work she had done. This was an installation called Listening Posts, and this whole installation came out of a 8-year stint of working with young girls who had experienced the 2002 riots in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad, and she had worked with them over a period of 8 years. And in that period, she sort of made one of the outcomes was also these performative posts, where she placed her diaries and her recordings, and various books that she had made of thinking about practice, of thinking about that whole time. And here she sort of offered this as a kind of infrastructure for us, a curatorial form to think about, to invite other artists to occupy this space. And this kind of code switching between reading and viewing, and a very, very affective space which spoke about voice and testimony and the ability to listen, or even the way that, to think about time and practice and patience through a period. That sort of, created a very different understanding of what the reading room could be. At the height of the pandemic, we also brought together a group of artists, individuals, and collectives who were working with the agrarian as part of a reading group. We outlined the space as responding to a particular necessity in the field, and the kind of grantees and artists that we were coming across who were sort of thinking around the agrarian. Rangamata's Documenta, of course, built in another kind of global dialogue around this, as did the farmers' protests in India and the pandemic, where a lot of artists went back home to their villages and then sort of working with land, with agricultural and ecological questions. So the idea was also to think about this network of locally rooted prayer practitioners from different locations and inviting them to converge around the concerns they were sharing. It was fascinating to see the kind of conversations that emerged. For example, one of the dialogues that we had was around the question of borders, and within the traditional agrarian practices also, the borders of the field are places that we sort of leave because they have their own ecology, and now with kind of industrialized agriculture, the borders are places that are constantly being legislated, are constantly being controlled, fences are built, burned, all of these things. So how one might think about the ecology of the border was something that Grammar Project, this group from Madhya Pradesh, brought up. Within the permaculture discourse that somebody, like an urban practitioner like Rashmi Pareka, who has a farm in Delhi, she was talking about, in permaculture, the whole idea of the edge is very important because it's in the edge that where two systems meet is the most fertile and the most productive site. So, at the edge of the farmland and the forest, at the edge of the pond, this water and land. And then to think of it with someone like Gopa Roy, who was talking from her experiences of working in a village in Tripura, where we shared the border with Bangladesh and what it meant to farm on the border or to farm in no man's land, and how one might think about mapping agricultural time to the national time when the gates opened and closed for such activities. So these kind of conversations around borders, for example, which were very much emanating from grounded practice, sort of opened up into others. Other conversations that we had around tools were very interesting as well, thinking about them with relationships with the body, with excellence, with innovation, with agency, with labor, of course. So these have been sort of very interesting gatherings, and over a period of 9 months, it led to the siting of it. We sort of built it into a physical reading room, because of course this was an online platform at the height of the pandemic, but it was also a smaller group. And we were also trying to think, it was also nice to open up the possibility to actually materialize it into a space, collating conversations and notes exchanged over WhatsApp and Zoom calls. We also turned this into a reading space where more sessions could take place and others could be invited to join the conversations. In the past year, the forum has taken a new turn, and we've been also visiting different sites and basing our exchange on physical encounters with specific landscapes and the strategies practitioners are deploying there. So this was in Delhi. This was the permaculture site. So we had Rashmi's teacher. So I just wanted to, one more experience that I wanted to share was our scale of operation continues to be small, motivated by thoughts on how we can redistribute these resources to artists and members of the art community and build and strengthen networks between them. Like the reading room and its various manifestations and resonances, our grand forums have also held on to some fluidity, and over the years, these have also been sort of moving, of course, supporting public art, emerging artists, but also sort of moving into more collective cohorts of practitioners. So while some of the grants like the Emerging Artists and Public Art grants have transformed into collective forums, others like the Himalayan Fellowship, this is a Himalayan Fellowship for Creative Practitioners, was launched with a cohort of 10 people. And this lateral expansion into the Himalayan regions around the west and the east of India has been a very exciting one. And it is a CSR initiative with Royal Enfield, and it's meant for people from the region, working in the region. And we have invited a group of 10 practitioners, selected a group of 10 practitioners from an open call, who are working at the intersection of artistic practice, indigenous or local knowledge, and ecology.
given the rapid ecological changes taking place in the region because of climate change, developmental projects, and tourism, the region has become very susceptible, and it's very urgent and necessary to amplify the work of local practitioners who are responding to these shifts, and also to build ties with environmentalists, scholars, researchers, policymakers, community leaders who are working on similar questions. Just to think around the past year where, we had these 10 grantees, and even to think around the kind of journeys that people were making, and this is an image from the exhibition that sort of brought this together. But here, this is Mo Naga. He's a tattoo artist from Manipur, but he belongs to the Naga community. And for this project, he actually wanted to build a tattoo garden. So he traveled 2,000 kilometers across the northeast, searching for these plants, and which are related to the tattoo practice. You have someone like Sering Motuk in Ladakh, who's traveling east to the west along the Indus River in Ladakh, documenting kitchens, utensils, displays, and recipes. And you have people like Saujanya and Sham from Himachal Pradesh who work. Sham comes from the Gadi. This is the pastoral community, the Gadis who are traditional pastoralists. And, sort of thinking around this expression of tension that the Gadi communities, this word tension that has sort of cropped up in the Gadi vocabulary, and their whole understanding of the kind of distress that human, animal, and ecology environment is facing in their region, and how, embodied that distress is. All of them speak about, all 10 practitioners in the last 5 talked about these kind of broken transmissions with traditional communities, their own traditional communities, and the complexities involved in mediating and building conversations to piece together intergenerational knowledge that is carried over and transformed in the contemporary context. And like Milo Anka's breeding roots, so Milo comes from the Apatani community in Arunachal Pradesh, and this was a very beautiful project where she was kind of looking at the totem making practice among the Apatanis, a practice that the women are not, women don't make the totem, so in a sense there's also one removal there, but also trying to think around this act of breeding and, the kind of strands that one has to pull together, and how this activity is very much a continuous and ongoing one. And this became a very important metaphor for us also. So now we've begun work on the second edition. One of the artists, he's from the Kalimpong region in West Bengal, Richie Dhakar. And his project is around building a collective of young practitioners in that place. He himself is a musician and a filmmaker, and he speaks about the highway that runs along the Teesta River. This highway actually connects the northeast to the rest of India, so it's a very important road. And yet, for the people living in this zone, it's a transition zone of, and there's immense loneliness and anxiety. Also, that region is also, because of climate change, it's very prone to glacial lake outburst floods, and also a lot of unpredictable conditions politically and climatically. So Dhakar shares a story at the start of his proposal he had shared with us. And this is a story that's often narrated in that area. That they say that there used to be a deer who used to live with a tiger. But once the houses and the roads came, the tiger disappeared. They say that the deer is now lonely. As the light changes from day to night, it sometimes comes to the shores of the Teesta and lets out a bark, as though it is looking for a host, as though it's looking for a lost friend. It is said that when the deer barks, Teesta claims a life, so that the soul may accompany the deer across the pastures. Ask anyone, when the deer barks, someone dies. And Vikit is proposing a kind of, and he's talking also about the amount of suicides that are taking place among the young people in his particular region, and proposing a kind of counter infrastructure of a rented music room on the highway for young musicians to jam. And this is a project that he's done. A coming together of bloggers, musicians, poets to strengthen their voices and share stories, share their stories. So, I think somewhere participating in this building of this counter infrastructure seems very urgent. And I don't know if this coheres well, but trying to think about our existence and future in a fast-changing landscape where corporate and business patronage are both acting as pressure, but allowing for a scaling of possibilities in terms of networks and resources. And our role as mediators in a long chain is to be able to generate value in a true sense to what artists are doing and to allow them to set the terms of what these exchanges can be. So these are really continuous acts of translation and action in the field and practices in the making. Thank you.
Thank you, Vidya. And please listen to this video first. We'll take some time to change this then. Thank you.
First of all, thank you both so much for your presentations. I thought there were a lot of differences in the context that you presented, but also some similarities. In terms of at least the forms of practice that the kinds of spaces that you're talking about are trying to generate. And maybe for this discussion, I thought I could start off with a question that has come up yesterday also, but one that came up earlier today in Nicole's presentation as well, which is that many of these alternative, independent spaces, they have actively encouraged or given platform to practices that are experimental or that aren't reliant on producing objects per se, art objects. But as quite a few people have also mentioned earlier, the market is always very quick on the uptake when it comes to sort of, in its perpetual sort of quest for newness, it appropriates or brings within its fold many such practices that may not have been so palatable until a while ago. So spaces like the alternative art spaces in Taiwan that you spoke about, IT Park or Space 2, or even organizations like Fika, must have seen many artists and forms of practice that, which have entered, say, gallery context or have now become part of museum collections, and finding, different routes of and modes of recognition. I'm curious what your take is. What is your response to something like this? And I ask because some people also hold the obverse position to be true, which is that, when such a thing happens that, one, either that alternative practice loses something of itself, or it leads us to question, the relevance of these spaces, as Krithia also did yesterday, to ask, are these spaces relevant anymore? But as people who are researching or working within the context of such spaces, I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are about this.
我想那个替代空间或是艺术家的这个艺术家空间或者所谓的独立艺术空间，我想它其实是反映一个时代的精神，所以它一定会有它那个时间点它最适合做的事情。例如90年代、80年代末、90年代初，它可能对于整个社会体制的一些批判。但是像是我刚刚提到的1991年到1994年那几篇文章，其实都已经谈到说，替代空间并不是绝对反商业，也不是绝对反美术馆，他们其实只是要创造一个自由可以创造的空间，然后艺术家也要生存，所以这个艺术的买卖其实也不是什么也是很重要的，他们生存的一个方案。那他们进到美术馆或者进到更大的双年展体系， 其实也是一个他们在人生的艺术的生涯上面的不断的进阶。所以我觉得这个没有什么觉得说是这些空间好像失去了某些精神，因为在某些时间点会有空间出现，会有空间消失。3年前Nicole 刚开始跟我谈这个计划的时候，我们有一个round table discussion， 然后那时候我的学生告诉我，我很多年轻的学生刚毕业之后，他们不愿意做空间，不愿意处理艺术家空间，因为要经营一个空间非常的辛苦，需要很多很多的资源。他们宁愿去筹组公司，然后用公司的名义去承接政府的各种计划以及艺术节、艺术季。3年之后的今天，我礼拜5才在上我的这个艺术实践的课。我们要学生要找空间去做展览，那学生要展览空间一定不会是主流的体制，一定就是希望找一些替代空间或是这种艺术家经营的空间。我本来以为这种空间会很少，结果昨天的课堂上面，我们赫然发现有很多，而且有很多新出现的。那他们的这个经营模式，有的是包括了驻村。那通过驻村的方式，它可以跟国外的驻村单位互相交换。那当然也包括了政府的补助案，也可以进到这样的一个机构来。然后也有所谓的合作画廊 corporate gallery， 由这些成员一起来分担租金。例如现在我知道有像未命名，或者是复合式的书店加咖啡厅，像棚丁。像今天的表演的双屋，可能也是艺术家自己的这个空间。所以还有另外一个是昨天我才发现的非常烂，他们原来的机构在基地在罗东，那现在在台北有一个新的空间，所以有点像是又从这个本来在谈台北的租金很贵，没有办法适应这些独立空间的生存，然后必须要到很远的地方去开空间。但是现在的状况又返回来了，所以我会说，会不会是每个时间点有不同的需求？那这些艺术家经营空间其实就是一个非常灵活的一个有机体，它不断的去回应现实的需要，现实需要批判，它批判现实；现实需要更多的实验空间，它提供实验空间给这个地方。如果这个现实需要有一群人一起来做事，他们可能就成立一个团队，一起去接一些案子。我想很多台湾的地下空间，其实当你回头去看，从那一年开幕到现在也40-50年了，空间来来去去，来来去去。每个空间其实命运非常短暂，但如果他有在他短暂的命运里面做到他的时代精神，有做到他的关键角色，他的版面其实是会让人家记得更清晰、更深刻的。那在这一次看这个 AA 的这个档案计划里面，我也是了解了很多我以前不太知道的这些空间，尤其是非常短命的这些空间。那也透过这样的一个档案计划，对于研究者而言，可以重新去帮这些空间定位。所以那个经营的时间的长短，我觉得是其中的一部分，但它并不是一个最主要的考量的关键。
I think since, in these past years, we've also seen how, holding a space is something that it needs to have its own logic. But I think we've seen the kind of coming together of a lot of years, even the way that we've been functioning, because that's what I was also trying to share, has been quite fluid. And, as much as in the initial years when we were doing grants, and our relationships with artists were quite limited in a sense that we would sort of, we've been thinking around how we can sort of extend these relationships. And of course, people do get commercial exhibitions and they get, and that's good in a sense. We're also seeing how much of, the kind of work that they're doing is also expanding into building collectives, extending beyond just their own practice, but also sort of nurturing a larger ecosystem around them. And I think even in the nature of the kind of grants and support that we are giving, there's been a shift in terms of building forums. So, when you think of giving an award to one person versus 10, it immediately changes the ground in terms of how one might think of what that forum itself is, or what the idea of emerging in a sense or emergence shapes itself. And that has been quite important. And I think, in what I was also trying to think about the way that the non-profit, the foundation sector in India has gone from something which was very subterranean, or kind of the idea of the alternative, which has sort of been taken over by the larger institutions, and of course that kind of scaling does produce a lot of movement as well. And I don't think it's all the institutions are not necessarily the same, and all the movements that they're producing are also not the same. But I think it's important for smaller institutions like us to be there, because I can also see how much of, like for example, in a city like Delhi or even in other cities, a lot of artists, organizations are coming back, a lot of artist collectives are also being set up constantly. So recently when I visited Shantiniketan, it was very interesting to see the way that the young artists are sort of setting up little spaces. And this question of what space does, because it sort of produces another imagination of, so in Shantiniketan, young artists sort of building little ecosystems which are sort of rethinking what infrastructure is, what the university offers to them, and even rethinking what Shantiniketan and that entire landscape is, and how a lot of younger people are coming back to Shantiniketan for short periods and sort of, using that as a base. So I think space in that sense becomes very critical, because it also allows people to sort of see themselves located somewhere, even if they go away and they come back. And I think in that sense, that's something to sort of, that's one way that we sort of keep things.
I think what you're saying was also resonating with something that Bailey mentioned in her presentation about one of the sort of definitions, one among the many definitions of an alternative space is the temporary sort of nature of it, right? Like, and not just that they're short run, but the question is, so are these sort of just like this waiting zone until, say, something bigger happens? And it's something worthwhile to think about, even as we see around us a lot of new collective spaces, co-working spaces, studio spaces that are coming up, is that it becomes a sort of a system of support, rather than sort of struggling it out individually as artists, as young artists who just graduated from art school. You're coming together and at least forming some kind of support structure for oneself. But then the question that always lingers is that, is it just a waiting game until, say, somebody makes it? Or is there something that actually holds that space together? And I think it varies from place to place, right? As I'm sure it must. But this question of the short life of these spaces also brings me to the second question, which has to do with this fear of becoming an institution, which again was something raised before, which is that many of these spaces emerged, from specific context to address specific, needs, requirements by the artists. And some of them, of course, closed down sooner, and some of them have stayed on for much longer for various reasons. Each one has its own qualities. The ones that shut short sooner and the ones that stay on longer, they encounter also a different set of questions, urgencies, issues. So I have two separate questions for both of you based on this. For Pei, I guess my question is that among all the spaces, the independent art spaces in Taiwan, could you maybe give us an example of one space that stayed on for longer? And what shifted and what stayed the same within that space? And is this sort of the fear of institutionalization even a valid concern? If you could share something.
我要对于第一个问题再做一点补充。就是这些独立艺术空间，其实还有另外一个非常重要因素是人的因素。很多年轻刚毕业的艺术家，他们没有地方展览，或是他们国外回来的，例如像一通或是安华公寓，他们没有地方展览，所以他们开始创建了空间。但是这中间可能有人要结婚生孩子，然后他搬到别的地方去，人会一直不断的改变，所以其实也是这个空间其实是会跟着这个人的移动而变化的。那刚刚提到的第二个问题是，这些空间如何持续下去，然后在台湾这些很长命的空间，他们是哪一些？那像一通公园，我们刚才提到的1988年他们成立，然后在前几年陈慧乔退休之后，一通公园其实还是持续存在。但是在慧乔时代的一通公园，可能跟慧乔退休之后的一通公园，可能必须要划成不同的阶段。那另外一个长命的这个艺术家经营空间，其实是萧丽红老师的竹围艺术工作室。那是因为萧丽红老师的去世，所以这个空间收起来了。那如果萧丽红老师持续的健康的持续在这个地方的话，这个工作室它其实已经发展成一个比较像是公司体制，它自己的体制化跟国际的接连已经非常的密切了，其实是可以更稳固的继续的发展下去的。但是主要的这个主持人的离去，那就会造成即使你有再好的支持资源，可能都无法持续。那另外一个到目前为止也非常长命的是 OCAC Open Contemporary 打开当代。他们从2000年开始是从学生去对学院做批判开始的，然后从板桥到2010年搬到台北市中心的城中艺术特区。2013年，因为城中艺术特区只有2年的一个实验的阶段，他们离开，决定搬去曼谷，所以他们是到泰国曼谷去开了一个空间，持续了半年还是1年的时间。那这样子的一个机缘，其实他们就可以去连接东南亚，他们对东南亚的理解是一种身体的理解，而不是只是大家平常交往的这种理解而已。后来他们回到台湾，先是在士林的一个空间，那现在搬到大稻埕的一个空间。今年应该是他们的25周年。那他们的成员也是进进出出，但是总是会有一个主要的成员去维持这个空间的方向。跟去主持所有的这些事情，所以让这个空间可以持续的走下去。那我想这个都是看这一群人他们要怎么样去互相的协商，以及他们对于这个空间的想象、希望跟视野， 那就会决定这个空间需不需要继续走下去，要用什么样的方式继续走下去。
Okay. And for Vidya, I mean, so FICA has been around now for 15 years. It has grown, but not in the typical sort of, corporate sense of growth. I mean, there's no scaling up of, staff, of, the team. Even in terms of the projects and the grants that you choose to sort of carry out, there's careful consideration. But from this sort of long-term, sustained sort of engagement of a space like FICA, I'm curious, what are sort of some of the shifts that you've seen, or that the, insights you've gained through this, and in terms of what it contributes to the field, let us say, if you could share something.
I mean, I think one in a sense that given the lack of institutions, I think, the fact that we would like institutions like FICA or many others. I mean, I mentioned the artists' foundations, which are also kind of, being set up and have been set up with the intention of sort of really creating a momentum and being there in a way, and, artists have bequeathed their inheritance and life's work to make this happen, and it's a wonderful thing. But I'm also thinking about the fact that in a lack of infrastructure, the sustaining of institutions is necessary, and now the fact that the shift is also towards building a lot of temporary scaled up spectacular infrastructure as much, whether it's with the festivals, whether it's with art fairs, and all of this, things that just come and disappear, and are so much based on the event and the spectacle of the event, but how might one sort of, also sustain something in a much lower tenor, which is an ongoing practice. Also, the focus of an institution like FICA, which has been on the emerging artists, so that's also a younger group of artists who are of course getting considerably more attention in this period than they have in the past. And there is a kind of interest in the contemporary across the world, and definitely in India as well. But it's also a group that, could be nourished and sustained and engaged with, because it's not as if everything is resolved necessarily with that attention. And what we're also seeing, I think, over the years is like I was saying, these kind of shifts to collective forums. It's in these interstices and in these conversations between people that were sort of understanding the larger scene, and so the idea of the gathering becomes very important, and the idea of bringing people together and building these dialogues and sort of sustaining them over time.
Okay. I have more questions, but I think we'll take questions from the audience at this point. We have a question there.
Hi, Vidya. I traveled to New Delhi in the beginning of this year for Indian Art Fair, ever since I started to explore more about the Indian art. And I have a question for you, is that it seems that many art spaces and initiatives in India are primarily supported by the private collectors and the foundations. And in this context, what roles do academy or art schools and the government play in shaping or supporting the contemporary art landscape, or are they just absent? Thank you.
I mean, I think the art schools, of course, have been an important ground in which a lot of art practitioners are coming. I mean, I think in terms of infrastructure, sometimes that might be the sole infrastructure for a lot of people, right? The fact that there is a huge network of art schools from the colonial period onwards to now. And what we're also seeing, of course, is that there's a lot of impoverishment in these institutions, cutting down and they've always been on the lowest pecking order of the educational system in any case, but we also see quite a lot of curtailing and censorship and lack of resources. Teachers, a lot of artists, a lot of educators are not as present, like the Baroda School, for example, has been facing problems from 2007 onward. So that infrastructure does exist. The government institutions are there and they're doing their role, and there's also, we do see quite a lot of interest in the symbolic capital of culture now, which is worrying for us because so far we've been sort of under the radar as well, the fine art category in that sense. But what is also interesting is that we're seeing practitioners from other fields as well, like this insulated field of the art. The artist community only coming from a fine art education is sort of breaking down, and it has been happening over the last 2 decades. So like say for the Himalayan Fellowship, we found, we also called it the Himalayan Fellowship for Creative Practitioners because we knew that there are not as many art colleges in this region of the Himalayas, and we didn't want to exclude, and we also knew there's a huge explosion of cultural production happening with music, with contemporary dance, with performance and film, and all of these mediums which are very interesting to sort of bring together. So, there is that happening as well. So, in that sense, that's pretty much the picture of the fact that universities are there, of course, but I think they also, and there are a few private universities that have come up which are offering art programs, but they're quite expensive. So that's something to consider.
And then there's another question.
就是很谢谢今天的讲者的一个发表。那这边的问题会想特别针对佩老师去做访问。其实我很喜欢这一个单元的前面的语言，就是说其实独立艺术空间其实跟这个体制不应该被分为一个二分法的一个状态。然后佩老师在过来的一个场合有提到说，其实机制也是可以思考。的，它并不是一个不能变动的一个状态。所以我还蛮好奇，就是说，因为比如说1983年，就是北美馆开始，就是台湾有一个第一个独立的一个现代美术馆体制逐步在改变。那在相对于独立艺术空间发展的过程当中，就是1980年代以来的，比如说美术馆啊，或者是一些不同的一些机制文化治理，有没有哪一些早期关键的一些具有实验性的一些精神的一些时刻？那当这些体制开始越来越实验的时候，它可能更加在推动说早期替代空间要去替代东西，可能美术馆他们已经可以做到。那这样的话，我觉得好像也是更是在推动独立艺术空间，就是说，他们替代东西被看对象不见了，但他们反而可以有更多的实验的一个可能。因为我一直在想说，台湾有没有像台湾如果最早比较具有实验性，或者像这是有在场的，就是 Charles H. 他的提出的这一种实验机构主义这样的概念，在台湾最早期的一些案例，是佩老师怎么去把它点出来和看待？
谢谢你的问题。我想我还是回到年代初的这一段来举例。北美馆1983年成立，但是成立之初当然不太清楚到底当然是什么，而且北美馆其实开头是现代美术馆，台北市立现代美术馆。那当这个当代这个词汇其实是要到了90年代之后，才在不同的展览里面交错使用，有的展览叫现代，有的展览叫当代。直到2000年之后，当代这个词汇才比较明确的挂在所有的展览上面。那我想在90年代初的这些替代空间，他们希望的就是美术馆没有办法接受的这些事情，他们先来做。 所以像是2号公寓，他们做了很多，做了几年之后，在1991年的92年的这个行为与实验，是由美术馆这边提出来的邀请展，所以他们在里面展出了他们的公寓，甚至在这个公寓里面，他们的展场也失火了，然后在现场灭火，所以整个的空间基本上就是毁坏的状态。在这个毁坏里面，他也推动了美术馆的保险制度，以及美术馆未来对于这些展览，希望有什么样的更多的支持资源，以及在法律上面的层面的这些事情。所以等于是在一个这些艺术空间的艺术家们，他不仅在他们的空间里面做实验，去对外去展示，但同时当他们被受邀到美术馆里面的时候，他们也可以用某些方式去推动一些事情，虽然这些事情可能是一个偶然的这些机会，但是因为他们之前的这些精神，他们是希望要讨论、要论述、要思考，已经不是只是去讨论艺术技术的问题了，而是去关心整个社会的体制生态的问题。所以当他们的这个火灾的事件发生之后，其实更多的状态是去思考未来也许在这个机制上面可能可以有什么样子的这个回复的这个可能性。那我想在北美馆大概是91年到92年是一个很奇怪一个关键转折点。在92年之前，北美馆有非常多乱七八糟的展览，包括了插花展、外交体育展、什么卡通漫画展，什么都有。然后到了92年之后，所有的展览这些奇怪的展览就消失了，那转向的更多是更多的策划型的展览，甚至双年展的这个系统也是从1992年开始已经改了一个名字，只是那个台北双年展到1996年是比较明确，但是在1992年的时候已经有台北现代美术双年展这样的词出来了。所以在美术馆的机制上面，我觉得它也是跟着整个时代的这个需要，跟会聆听外部的声音，去调整它自己的作为。那北美馆有几个展览就是这种非常具有转向性的展览。那这个行为与实验就是其中一个系列的展览，带进了更多这些更具有活力跟批判性的艺术家在美术馆里面。
Thank you. Any further questions?
Thank you for your presentations. I have a question for both of you. And it's about the sense of publicness that you talked about that's associated with the artist-run and also small-scale spaces that you discussed in your presentations. For me, that's something that's quite interesting because oftentimes we think about publicness in the arts in relation to public funding or these bigger principles of transparency or accountability. But the type of publicness that you both talked about, I think it really invites us to think more creatively how this is a sense that can be negotiated. So I'm wondering how your understanding of this term has changed over time and also through these small-scale and artist-run spaces that we talked about. Thank you.
I think one publicness is also the art community itself. Right? A lot of our publics are also sort of, in that sense, the artists themselves, and sort of thinking about the conversations that are happening here and how those need to be kind of nurtured. But also, I think one of the reasons we also, this question of audience has been something very important to us. It's something that we also want to rethink in a sense, because, even say with something like the Modern Grant, having a CSR initiative or having a funder
question of what it means to work in the Himalayan region, and is looking at a whole broad spectrum of various kinds of initiatives, whether it's with environment, whether it's with livelihood projects. So we're embedded within a larger ecosystem of projects that they're doing. But in terms of how they are understanding questions of preservation, conservation, heritage, these words, or even tradition, and because of course these regions are quite removed, but also the way that we have been, we have a colonized mindset about all of these questions even within the long discourse within the Indian context. So the figure of the artist actually is someone who's able to move with great agility and break some of these ideas. And I think it becomes very important to think of our funders as audience as well, or the kind of people that they bring around them. Because there are certain ways in which movements are occurring, and I think in terms of how these artists are negotiating questions of say, indigenous knowledge, or of these translations into contemporary times, or the way that they're bringing together different strands of mobilization into the landscape. And I think that in itself is something, so that becomes one aspect of sort of, whether we could sort of, and the more we empower people in the region, or the more that we sort of build voices that can take these conversations forward, this will have a multiple effect. I mean, this is not a discourse that needs to only come filtered through one, but I think it's in the collective gathering of people that these processes take place. So I think this whole question of audience becomes very complex, and how we produce publicness and how we use these occasions to build conversations is very important.
关于公共性的这个部分，我想从最简单的层次来说，像是22公寓开门早期，一定强调每个展览一定要有座谈会。这个原因在于，一般我们去看美术馆的展览，只有观众跟作品在现场，你没有办法跟艺术家面对面的做讨论。所以他们的这个座谈会一定是艺术家在现场，可以直接提问，跟观众做直接的回应。所以这一种推广，或者是把当代艺术介绍给观众，用更深刻的方式，其实是一个我说最简单层次的这个公共性。那再来是Nicole在那个报告里面有提到的，当90年代中期国艺会成立之后，我们有更多的补助系统。当这个单位是接受了国家的纳税人的资金的时候，他们去思考的就是更多的这些公共活动，或是怎么样让这个公共性可以扩张，去服务更多的人。那另外一个案例是2010年成立的台北当代艺术中心TCAC， 其实当初成立的时候是对于文化政策的抵抗。在成立之后，不断的有大型的论坛，其实都是去批判政府的都更政策，或是政府的一些双年展的某些的缺失，所以它变成一个公共的论坛的方式。那 TCAC 维持了10年，也是结束了。我想每个单位都是有它那个时代性的任务之类的，所以我想那个公共性可能会有很多不同的样貌。那从最小的去面对观众，到面对纳税人，到面对整个国家体制政策，都是不同的层次。
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, we are out of time. Thank you, Vidya, and thank you, Pehi, very much for your presentations. And thank you to everybody.